welcome to the latest episode of the modestly named Rob Harkavy interviews, only on Outnews Global. Now, my next guest was born profoundly deaf and grew up in West Wales. She had a cochlear implant at the age of 4, so she is able to hear, but nonetheless, growing up deaf and gay in a rural area can be a pretty lonely experience. She's in the process of creating an app aimed at addressing this issue. So let's give a massive Outnews Global welcome to the wonderful Sian Stephens. Hello, Sian.
Hello, Walt. Hello.
So thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you on board. Now, a lot of people who are watching this have got no experience of knowing people who were deaf. So perhaps, can you take us through what it was like growing up as a profoundly deaf kid in a hearing world in quite a remote area?
Absolutely. Yeah, so from the beginning, it was always a case of having to adjust to the hearing world. So even as a young age, I was constantly having to learn how to accommodate myself in order to be able to communicate with hearing people. But I was very fortunate in the fact that both of my parents, pre-cochlear implant operation, I was able to communicate with them because they both took it upon themselves to learn BSL. And then after the operation, I did several rounds of speech therapy. I worked with a lot of audiologists. But yeah, I think all in all, growing up as a young deaf child, surrounded by hearing people, it was definitely tough. And I think it still sticks with me, as in, like, I'm constantly trying to make sure that people are able to communicate with me, not that are they able to communicate with me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So
yeah.
At some point during this growing up, you also realized that you were gay, which is kind of, I don't want to go back to Little Britain and the only gay in the village, but I know you grew up in quite a remote rural area, so you may have been one of the only gays in the village. And of course, that in itself must have been more isolating. What sort of age were you when you, I first of all, came out to yourself before coming out to the wider world?
Yeah, so I think I knew pretty early on. I think I must have been about 7 or 8, and I remember being in primary school and then thinking, okay, well, I don't have crushes on the boys like my friends did. So it was kind of like, oh, okay, I knew something was up, and I think my parents kind of already knew. It was not a shock to them at all when I did eventually come out. But yeah, it did come with a lot of internalized struggles, in a way, being the only person in a rural village, not knowing anyone else who is deaf or gay. I think the only person I knew that was gay was like several years older, so it was always like there was no one to really look to, so I'd looked for various forms of like media, so like movies, music, anything that involved gay people, I would look to as a source of representation for me. Yeah, it was tough, definitely.
Yeah, I used to do a bit of work for Diva magazine, and I know that they were constantly getting sort of letters or emails from women who grew up in sort of quite remote areas, saying Diva was a lifeline for them.
Yeah, I remember reading that as well. That's another thing I would like, because obviously it was the pre-internet. Well, like we had MySpace. It was MSN and MySpace, but yeah, I remember the Diva magazine. I remember like different versions of magazines when celebrities would talk about their coming out stories. And I used to store these magazines, and I'd be like, okay, this is how they did it, and this is how they felt. And I like recognized myself in those. So yeah, those magazines were the world of good. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned MySpace, which is no good to man nor beast, but you're quite young, and I'm not going to be indelicate and ask your age. So at some point, social media, more or less as we know it today, began to kick in. And I'm guessing, given that where you're from, that expanded your universe massively, probably almost overnight, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think being able to communicate with people who are like you at the touch of a button was a revolutionary thing. It was, you know, it was eye-opening because like you could recognize and find other people like you. But yeah, it was still limited in the way that, you know, I couldn't really truly find people my age near me who were like those are the same things that I am, you know. So yeah, it was a struggle.
Is there an identifiable queer deaf community on social media?
There is like social media posts. You know, you have Facebook and you have the British Deaf Association. But I didn't really find them to be useful. They are really incredible, useful resources in order to be able to obtain information on, you know, the medical side of things. But I still felt like the social side for myself as a cochlear implant user was really lacking in that area. So yeah.
So talking of cochlear implants, before we get into the main thrust of this interview, which is a hugely exciting thing, and I'm not going to mention any spoilers. A lot of people would have seen the movie Sound of Metal. And just in case you're one of the few people who hasn't seen it out there, it's no spoilers, but it's about rapid onset hearing loss for a heavy metal drummer and how he comes to terms with it. And he has a cochlear implant. Now, for those of us in the hearing world with very little experience of that sort of thing, I think it's hard for me to speak to everybody else, but I'm guessing a lot of people think that a cochlear implant is almost like a miracle drug, and it kind of returns you, if you have previously been a hearing person, to life as before. But the one thing the film does tell you is that ain't necessarily so. Now, it's hard for you because you've never heard naturally, but are you able to explain what a cochlear implant does and how it's difficult for people who have gone deaf rather than who have been born deaf sometimes to come to terms with using it?
Absolutely. So to begin with, just to explain what the cochlear implant is, basically there's two sides of the cochlear implant. You have the internal part of the cochlear implant and the outer part of the cochlear implant. The internal has electronic electrodes which are wrapped around your cochlea. So like people who have sustained nerve damage or who have no hearing, it's wrapped around it. And you have the outer processor, which has a microphone, and then sound is transmitted via that. And yeah, so that's how it all works. It's not a fix. This is the biggest misconception I think a lot of people have, is that they believe it to be a fix and you're not deaf anymore. But when I take off my processor, I hear nothing. You know, I'm literally in a world of no sound. And I think that's the biggest misconception about the cochlear implants. Definitely. It is an excellent device, but I think my experience is not universal, of course, due to the fact that I had it when I was a child. It was a pretty early on in Wales as well, because there was, I think, prior to me, there had been 4 operations of the cochlear implant. And then I was the first girl in the Wales.
Wow.
But this was very early on, and this was back in the day where, you know, they were bulky. They weren't what you see now, as in like the tiny things you see, but they were bulky pieces of machinery. But I think I'm lucky in a way in that I was able to not know anything else. So I can't, you know, bridge and say my experience is relevant to that who have gone through hearing loss in adulthood, because there's different emotional aspects to that I would never be able to understand of that of a, you know, person who's lost their hearing during adulthood. Yeah, so it's a great advice. But
yeah, do you find yourself taking it off or disconnecting it because you want peace and quiet?
Absolutely, I do it very frequently. That's one of the things about like being a deaf person, is that with the cochlear implant anyway, is that you get exhausted at the end of the day just purely because you have to concentrate to listen to people. You have to lip read. You have to, you know, there's so many sounds, especially now, you know, with traffic, with music, with everything. So yeah, I do often find myself just taking it off at the end of the day just to have some silence and like let my brain recuperate.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, let's get on to the main point of this interview. I stumbled across you on Facebook and you posted something about an app you were creating. And I just thought, no, that looks good. Let's have her on the show. So, Sian, the floor is yours. Tell us about your app.
Absolutely. So the app in itself is an app called Hear Me Out. And this app is meant to bridge the entire deaf community together, people with hearing loss together, people with cochlear implants together. As it stands right now, there's no way in the current social media to be able to find other deaf people like you in the same area, to be able to connect, to be able to do it all in the space of one thing. You have to go on different several pages.
Right.
So the main reason I wanted to create this app is because now the current social media trends, everything's app-based. And I really wanted a place that I, not just only myself, but a lot of deaf people could go to, click the app, and then you find people who are like you at the touch of a button. So yeah, there's lots of aspects to it. There's going to be a chat-friendly messaging service on there that you'll be able to speak to deaf people. There's going to be links to deaf-friendly events, deaf, captioned theatre shows, everything that will help the deaf community. And I just really wanted to do it because I found myself needing something. And I think if I needed it, then there's thousands of other people that need it too, So, yeah.
So explain to a middle-aged geezer like me, who kind of knows how to use apps, but let's face it, it's not a world we grew up in, where you go from in your head thinking, I wish there was an app for that. Hang on, there isn't an app for that. I'm going to make an app for that, to actually taking the plunge and create. I mean, I wouldn't know where to start. Take us on the journey to where you are now from the idea in your head.
Yeah, absolutely. So it all started with, me reflecting on the feelings that I felt as a deaf person, the feelings of isolation, loneliness. And, there's a point in life where you feel, okay, enough is enough. I need to do something about it. It started off purely as a way for me to want to meet other deaf people. But then I thought, you know what, this is something that could fill the gap in the market. There's nothing out there right now on the market. And I was like, you know what, no, I'm going to take it upon myself and create this. And then my university was offering like a competition where they help you with like startup funds and office, so you can start to create the app from. And I entered, and I was lucky enough to win all 3 rounds of the competition.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, it's been a crazy whirlwind. I'm very grateful. So I went through that, and so now it's going to be time to develop it and then get it launched. So yeah, it's all very busy.
So have you got a time scale for that?
I'm hoping at some point this year, at the end of this year, or possibly next year.
Okay, and will you come back and talk to us again once it's up and running, and you're sitting in your beachside residence in Malibu counting your money?
Well, let's see.
Okay.
Yeah.
How can people find out more? Is there a Facebook page or any kind of URL that people can go to find out more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I have posted on several Facebook groups, especially deaf-friendly Facebook groups. I will be creating a website for it shortly, and we'll be sharing it everywhere. So people, if they wanted to find out more about it, they're more than welcome to check out the website. And I'll be releasing more information about the app when it's launched.
Well, you'll keep us posted so we can tell the wider world. Now, Sian, the clock has beaten us, and I have to say, I've done, since the first lockdown, I think I've done about 90 of these interviews, and few people have impressed me more to actually think that the market needs something, create it, win a competition to do it, and then be actually doing it, especially living in a strange town hundreds of miles from home. It is hugely impressive. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And it only remains for me to wish you much love luck and happiness. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed thoroughly speaking with you. I wish you the best.